Welcome back to the Sports Business Series podcast. Today we're joined by Tim McDermott. Thanks for joining the show, Tim.
Yeah, great to have you guys. Appreciate it.
Under Tim's leadership at the Union, the club's achieved historic high watermarks in ticket sales, partnership revenues, and fan engagement. He's also spearheaded major community infrastructure investments, including the development of the Wisfis Bank Sports Complex along the Chester waterfront for the Union. And before the Union, he was the CMO of the Philadelphia Eagles and the Sixers, playing key leadership roles in driving innovation and brand growth. And in today's conversation, we'll discuss leadership across multiple sporting leagues, the future of fan engagement, sports anchor development, and advice for companies to work with teams and leagues. So again, Tim, really excited to dive in. Welcome to the show. We'd love to hear more about your journey and career.
Sure. Yeah, happy to share. As you mentioned, yeah, I started my career in 1995 with the Jacksonville Jaguars. I started as a graduate from Cornell, and I started there as an intern when they had just been awarded a franchise. So it was their first year as an expansion franchise. Started in football operations and was there for about 6 months. At which point I got a full time job in both the football side and the sponsorship side, and I just thought it was the best path for me was more on the business side, and so I moved into that role and I was there for 3 or 4 years at the Jaguars, and then I went to the San Diego Chargers, a director of sales and marketing, and then I got the itch to go to business school, so I did that. And upon graduating, went to work for Comcast in a strategic planning role for 3 or 4 years, which was really good to kind of see the world outside of the sports world for a bit. And then I did, decide to go back into the sports field, working for the Eagles twice and Washington Capitals and 76ers now here. So it's been a fun journey, predominantly, driven by a lot of team sports, but across a lot of different leagues. So it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's exciting, Tim. And so did you play with Rob at Cornell?
He's older than me. Yeah, we did not play, but yeah, Rob was a very good player at Cornell. So you think he's a running back, if I remember right?
Okay. For everybody listening, we're talking about Rob Buccini. We had him on the podcast not too long ago. But
Yep.
to dive into the first question here, Tim, as you talked about, had leadership roles with the Eagles, Sixers, Capitals, and now the Union, which is pretty rare to work across several big four professional teams. So, can you talk about what are some of the biggest differences in how leagues like the NFL, NBA, NHL, and MLS approach doing business, specifically when it comes to fan engagement and community engagement with the fans?
Sure. So it's interesting because I have about 45 interns that just started yesterday, and we bring them all into a room as part of their internship process. And they get a chance to I guess talk a little bit with myself and ask me questions. And similar kind of question came up. And one of the things I always tell people, when you work at the MLS, it's a very entrepreneurial venture. You're building brick by brick, you're slugging through it, and that entrepreneurial spirit is part of it, and it's fun and it drives you, and it's really attractive to certain people. And I compare that to, I'll say, like the NFL world, which is a very established, big, behemoth type brand, but probably not as entrepreneurial. Obviously, not as much of a startup, right? They get a 100-year head start on us, just from an enterprise standpoint. And so I think when you're in the environment that we are in, meaning MLS, you're going to basically work for 95 cents of the revenue pie. 95% of that revenue pie is local monies that we're trying to be responsible for. We're trying to generate ticket sales and sponsorship sales. And so when you think of that revenue pie, like how much of it is driven by the local market is heavily local for an MLS team. And if I compare that to some of the other leagues, you might say that their national TV deal is so big, and maybe some of the leagues have really big local TV deals that you kind of capture the local TV deal and the national TV deal together, that the remaining part of the revenue pie becomes relatively small, and maybe it's 40%, so to speak, that's outside of the national and local deals or other deals that are controlled at the league level. And so when you go to work at those leagues, but flipping on the lights at a team in the NFL, you'd hope you're going to get at least half of that, right? So your ability to really move the needle might be closer to like 20% is what you can really move the needle in some of those other leagues, not all, but some of those other leagues. Where I say, and again, going back to the MLS, like you have the ability to really move the needle in a significant way. Every ticket you sell matters. Every sponsorship deal you do matters. So there's a that sort of kind of ecosystem that we're operating in is a little bit different, and then I think that attracts a different person too to work in each of those environments. And it's not that one is right or one is wrong. I tell everybody, if you're working in PR as an example, and you're working in the NFL and you've got say you got a press conference that you want to, have later in the day, you can push an email out and hit send and tell everybody, hey, at 2 o'clock today we're gonna have a press conference, and you're gonna get 20 people to show up, cameras and reporters and journalists, et cetera, to show up. We on the MLS side, we're gonna call 20 people and we're gonna work the phones and we're gonna sell the idea of what the press conference is about and why you need to be here and really, sell it that way, to get people to show up from that perspective. And again, not that one's right or wrong, but I often say to people, when you get outside of the sports world, that is what it's like to work in a B2C, a classic B2C brand where, you're going to have to make those pitches, those phone calls. And so I think there's a lot of learning, quite frankly, that takes place when you're in a little bit more of the upstart challenger brand like we are, and how you go about your day-to-day job, right? Whether it be in PR, like I just mentioned, or it could be in ticket sales, or it could be in sponsorship sales. You're gonna really refine your tool set, so to speak, and get really good at it, which then is a great launching pad to wherever you go, whether it be to another MLS team or whether it be going to another league or whatever may have you. But so I'd look at these, the MLS is it's an incredible opportunity. I think the trajectory of the league is phenomenal. Obviously we're about to, get right into the World Cup here. We're just, really moving into that right now. And the hope is that's gonna catapult the MLS even further in not just 2026, but really, for the next, 5 or so, 10 years, and hopefully there's a good tailwind to this thing. So it's a great place to work. And again, as are the other leagues, right? There are some nuances, there are some differences, somewhat driven by the bigness of the league. The NFL, is such a massive, just years and years and years of doing so many things well and good and smart and bright people working there and great ownership, and now they have just incredible media deals and so many people. It's just this, flywheel that has happened in the NFL that has just allowed it to just continue to grow and prosper, and, I mean, it's incredible really what they've done, so give credit to them, and if I look at the leagues, the NFL obviously, probably number 1 in at least in America. But globally, soccer is, globally the number 1 sport, and so I think we've got a chance at the MLS to make some strides. And I've seen some reports recently on just the strength of the league and the appetite for soccer in the United States and where it's heading. And so, it wouldn't surprise me if, in the next decade, it becomes the, NFL and maybe NBA, and then we should be right there.
And it's something that I've never really thought about, like you mentioned, how the MLS is definitely more of an upstart league compared to an established league. And it's crazy because the NFL has been around for over 100 years compared to just about 20 years for the MLS, I believe. And it's also crazy to believe that with the Philadelphia Union, for example, and a lot of MLS clubs, a lot of them are valued at about 700 million compared to about 7 to 10 billion for an NFL organization. So that's something that I appreciate as an entrepreneur in sports. And I know the rest of the sports business leaders community can definitely appreciate because we're all entrepreneurs in the space and have that upstart mentality, just like you mentioned, is something that you have with the MLS.
Yeah, I think you're right in saying that. Again, I think the entrepreneurial spirit that we have, and the learning and the kind of the educational process that you go through by being at an MLS team is phenomenal, and it will serve any employee here that we have incredibly well, from a training standpoint. It'll be phenomenal. It's actually interesting. I think at one point in my career, I remember I was at the Eagles, and I went down to the Washington Capitals as a chief marketing officer. And a year into my job, I was having a lunch with, one of my employees there, and they were talking to me about, my first year on the job, and they said, "Hey, you're here for a year. People, like you. You're doing a good job, and but you don't know how to sell tickets." And I remember my initial reaction was like, "What do you mean I don't know how to sell tickets? I came from the Eagles. We have a 100-year waiting list. What do you mean I don't know how to sell tickets?" And he goes, "Exactly. You don't know how to sell tickets." And the person that told me that was right. At the time, I didn't. And I spent the next several years really trying to understand, what does it look like to sell tickets in an environment where you have a lot of inventory, i.e. the NHL or Major League Baseball, or, in our case, soccer, or even basketball. So, and they were right. Like, and I really had to understand that and learn that. So my point there is, when you get to some of these different leagues, there are amazing learning opportunities that take place. And I remember going back to the Eagles saying to people, you guys don't know how to sell tickets the second time I worked there. So, but yeah, it's, you learn different things at different places, in the sponsorship world of, working in an NFL environment, it's going to be probably a little bit easier to get certain meetings, and the concept of kind of category exclusivities and how you handle that and how you maximize revenue. That sort of conversation is going to be more important or more relevant probably in those sorts of
Yeah, and what you just mentioned there reminded me of something that Sean Tilger, who was the previous COO of the Flyers and Comcast Spectacor mentioned, is just that having different perspectives from several types of organizations is always gonna suit you better. And Sean, he's been a great mentor for us. He was on the podcast not too long ago, and I'm sure you probably know Sean just through the
Oh,
years,
yeah.
but he's a great guy, and I think he would probably agree with what you said there.
Yeah, I mean, look, getting a perspective, big companies, small companies, companies that operate on the West Coast versus the East Coast, versus the South, Midwest, like all of those refine you. And I think the really, smart, good business people figure out how to adapt to those different situations. And then there are people who can't, right? Then there are people who are really more, they are geared toward or better suited for this sort of a role, this sort of a company. So I think it's really impressive when people have the ability to kind of have worked in this league or that league and in this environment and that environment. And I figured out, taking a little bit of the best here and the best here and the best here and bring that to the next role. And like Sean said, having that perspective, I think is really positive.
Definitely. And one of the things too that I was just thinking about as you were talking is with Subaru Park, I really think, especially with the MLS, a big part of your growth and what you've been able to successfully do has been around the community there. So, how do you think about building a sports organizations more as an ecosystem rather than just a team?
Yeah, I think that concept, like you're talking about, which probably gets you into mixed use development, real estate. In our case, we have some of that as well as we have our first team, our second team, our academy. We did, like you said, we launched a $100 million sportsplex, which functions as like a 2-in-1 or 3-in-1, where we have our professional players using it, but then we also do for profit, soccer skills, drills, camps, clinics, but we also do lacrosse or field hockey or flag football. And then a third leg to that is the nonprofit piece to the community in Chester. So I think, as the sports ecosystem has evolved, you're seeing a lot more of this kind of take a stadium with mixed use and doing that together. And or you're seeing, clubs that, hey, they own whatever, an NFL team, and they have ownership of another team in another league or multiple teams in other leagues, right? Like a lot of the guys in the at the HBSE group. So you're seeing more of that. And I think, to the extent that there's more, I think, sophistication that's being brought into these team environments, folks from the private equity sector or capital sector coming into these environments, these are really smart, intelligent people that are coming in and driving growth and not necessarily, satisfied with just, hey, I just want a team, right? It's a team or it's a second, third, a fourth team. It's this other venture here, this other venture here, this real estate, whatever it may be. And that's I love it. I mean, that's exciting to me. And I think that's what the future of sports is looking more and more like that. You see probably less and less of just a single, owner owning a team and that's all they do. I think that more and more you're seeing these kind of offshoots, and it's creating, I think, a different executive that has to, kind of balance how do you run a sports team or how do you balance sports team with multiple sports teams or with ancillary businesses. And as more and more of the folks that are coming into the league and owning the league are from venture capital, private equity, finance backgrounds, it's actually creating the people like me to be a little bit more sophisticated in their world and how they do business and a much better appreciation for financials and financial statements and cash and cash flow and I think since I've been here, we've spent a lot of time on capital raises and what does that look like and so that is, I think, the new norm of working in sports, and it's a little bit different than I'd say when I started 30 years ago.
Yeah, and this reminds me just about the mixed use real estate, just about Brett Johnson from Rhode Island FC and Benevolent Capital. They have the Centerville Bank Stadium, which is about an 11,000 person stadium up there with Rhode Island FC, but they also have the Tidewater Landing District, which is the real estate surrounding that stadium. And I think that's just another good example of what you mentioned there. making sure that it's not just the stadium, you also have these other opportunities to engage the community outside of just the stadium.
Yep. I mean, even like I go back to my days of the Washington Capitals, and I believe it's called the Capital One Center now. I believe it is. At the time when I was there, it was the Verizon Center, and yeah, if you look back, even rewind the clock on that building and the mixed use around that building and the area that it's built in, and how the arena with the real estate and all the different retail, et cetera, kind of helped really change an area of Washington D.C. that wasn't so great many years ago, and now it's a pretty spectacular area.
That's a great point. And so with that said, I know we've hit on a bunch of different topics, but what other trends do you think will continue to shape the future of sports business and how teams are operating over the next several years to decade?
I mean, look, the obvious one that most people are going to say is what's going to happen with AI, and how does AI on the performance side of the sports side, like what happens with it, where does it kind of stop and start? And for years I've always thought in the NFL world that, and this is going back a decade or so, 2 decades maybe, I used to always think about at some point in time we were going to get to a place where somebody could sit in the room upstairs while the game's going on and literally type in, balls on the 37-yard line, it's 3rd and 7, and it has all this information built into it to say that the right play call is X. And similarly, on the other side, the defensive play call is Y. I'm not sure anybody wants to get to that level, quite frankly. I'm not sure that that's, the area that, would be, the best place for the sport to be in. So there's a fine line of like, how do you use some of this stuff as it continues to advance very quickly, by the way. So I think that's on like literally impacting the game part. And then there's, obviously the player, him or herself, and how we use it to help the player, whether it be with physiology, physical, the different things that you can do from a cognitive standpoint. So to me, I think I'm really intrigued to see like where this will shake out. But like I said, I do think there's an element of making sure that it, stays somewhat confined and doesn't get too far outside the scope where I guess we call it the integrity of the game, whatever game.
Definitely, and it reminds me of just the robotic umpires in baseball and the controversy around that, and, I think there's going to be a lot of change over the next, especially 5 to 10 years, and AI is only going to enhance that velocity, and there's also tons of different companies that we hear that's positively using AI to help with a variety of different aspects when it comes to the business side of sports, so it's exciting, and appreciate you sharing that, Tim.
Yeah. So I think that's on the pro side. I think in the on the and just in general in the sports ecosystem, one of the other areas that I've been watching or been part of, I guess, for the last decade or so is just the professionalization of youth sports. And my kids now are in junior in high school, ninth grade in high school, and so I've kind of seen what's happened and what's transpired in the youth sector, and it's fascinating. The amount of money, the amount of dollar flow through that, through the youth sports is incredible. As I said, the professionalization of the field is incredible, but also so is the pressure, right? That we're probably putting on kids, that I've certainly been guilty of as a dad, sports dad. And so I think that's a really interesting space as well. And you're seeing a lot of money, flow into the youth sector, from private equity and other spaces that I think is meant well, but at the same time, there are some, like I said, there are some pressures on that space, and there's pressures that are, I think, being applied to kids and or parents for that matter, of how do they, handle the situations, how to be a good sports mom or dad for your kids, and recognizing that there's a lot of stuff that's being asked of these kids that probably wasn't the way it was when I was a 15-year-old kid or a 12-year-old kid going through the sports landscape.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I attended the Buy and Sandlot conference in Philly, which is all about youth sports not too long ago, and that's definitely the sentiment of the whole youth sports industry, and we hear all the time that it's a 40 or $50 billion industry when you take in everything with the tournaments and technology and companies that are supporting the space. So, it's definitely one of those exciting verticals in sports, but just to round out the conversation, Tim, what advice would you give to somebody who's maybe like a version of you from 20 years ago who's looking to get to the level that you're at currently today?
Oh, wow. So, look, this is stuff I would tell my own children. Number one, I think, when I started in the sports world 30 years ago, it was it was very much teams and leagues, right? That was kind of the way you thought of the sports world. And, then obviously some media. The ecosystem, the sports landscape today is massively bigger, massively, massively bigger than what it was 30 years ago. And there's a lot of opportunities and are not just team or league opportunities. And I would encourage people to think about all of those different opportunities. For me personally, the thing that I'm kind of aligns most with me and my skill set is the concept of private equity in sports. And it's just to me, it's a really unique way to combine a lot of my personal interests, but like I said, I think there's a lot of different, opportunities today in the sports ecosystem, even, what you guys are doing. So, I think that's, one of the things I would say, just to be a little bit broader in their ideas of what it means to work in sports. I think, and I shared with other people yesterday in my internship class that came in, and advice that was given to me many years ago, and I think it was passed on from other senior executives was, it's not the what, it's the who. And so I think it is, younger people think about a career in the sports ecosystem, and of course the what is gonna excite you a little bit, but at the end of the day, I think most people that get into it realize you can have an awesome what you do with the wrong who you do it with, and it doesn't make it very fun. And similarly, you might have a what that you don't necessarily think is the most attractive, but when you have a really good group of people around you, with you, that can make it pretty special. And so I've always been, taking that advice is, thinking about the who more than what is a really good one. And then the other one, that I was my other, I guess, takeaway that I shared the story with others many times, but when I was in business school at Harvard Business School, I was working for Goldman Sachs as a summer intern. And the way they do their internship process is they will hire 100 people. Again, this was 30 years ago. So I don't know what it's like today, but 30 years ago, they hire 100 people. You come into this room and you have tests and quizzes, and it was pretty intense. And one of the things that was they'd ask you to do is meet with current employees, and you'd have to make these appointments on your own. So coffee, lunch, breakfast, whatever it may be, and make these appointments on your own. They didn't do it for you because they wanted to see, do you have the gumption, the initiative to go and do this? So I had made this appointment with a guy on the trading floor, and I pulled my stool up next to him and was sitting down. I was looking at a few different screens, monitors, and I was doing the normal, hey, why'd you go to work at Goldman Sachs? What do you like about working here? And all that type of stuff. And like 20 minutes into my little sits down with them, he just goes, "Stop." He goes, "Stop. I don't get you guys. Every single one of you does the exact same thing. You pull your chair up next to me, you ask me these kind of sophomoric questions." He's like, "Don't you understand? Like, you're gonna walk away. I'm gonna basically give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down. But what could I possibly say about you other than, seem like a nice guy and, had some a couple questions for me?" He's like, "I'm in the world of technology. I'm in the world of stocks, technology stocks, buying and selling technology. Like, if you want a job here, bring me value. Tell me 3 stocks I should be buying, 3 stocks I should be shorting. If you had come with those, I would have thought to myself, this guy is prepared. I would see how he thinks, and I'd be able to say, yes, he is a guy that should be sitting next to me in a year from now, and we should offer him a job." And that really hit me. And he was 100% because I went to that, meeting with him, with, mini interview, if you wanna call it that, with him, really not giving much thought to that. And what could he have said about me, right? And from that moment on, I've always been, mindful of that advice that he gave me, and I shared that with the intern class the other day, that if you want to, enhance your career, bring value. It doesn't matter if you're an intern, it doesn't matter if you're the president of a company, what value are you bringing the company? And, so I've always used that in my kind of my career, and I've shared that for me personally, but also sharing it with, other people, interns who were working for me that wanted a job. And, did they bring the company value? Did they go above and beyond to do that? So it's kind of the way, a big, I guess, principle and, kind of how I believe.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Tim. And I think that not only applies to the world of executives, but also for entrepreneurship. At the end of the day, I think when you're talking to a potential client, if you can think about what's in it for them and keep them at the center of the conversation or the center of whatever product or service you're trying to offer them, then that's how business gets done. Is if you just, like you said, add value and make a difference and think about what is really in it for them.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I appreciate you having me today. It's been fun.
yeah, Tim, I really appreciate it. And what would be the best way for everybody listening to keep in touch with you and follow along with the Philly Union?
Well, you can keep in touch with me. And I think I've found that it seems like nowadays LinkedIn seems to be the way to go. So, people reaching out to me through LinkedIn is always a great way. And I'll also mention this too. And I've shared this with, again, some of the younger staff. I think there's different ways to do that. You didn't ask me for this advice, but I'll pass it on. I think when somebody reaches out through LinkedIn, you can do the normal, hey, accept my whatever. But I really do believe that a little note that goes with it goes a long way. And specifically, if you're a younger person and you're in school, as an example, college, as an example, it's really easy to reach out and say, hey, can I connect with you? But what's more impressive is if you can say, "Hey, can I connect with you? I'm a junior at such and such school, a senior at such and such school. I've done a thesis in whatever, something related to sports." And my case, if you said, "Hey, I've done a thesis or a paper on how the MLS can increase their fan base," that's going to get my attention, right? I get a lot of requests. Hey, do you have 20 minutes to talk? And I'd love to say yes, but the reality that I probably don't. But if you said, "Hey, do you have 20 minutes to talk?" and I've done this paper on how the MLS can grow or how you can do digital marketing too, blah, blah, blah. That gets my attention, and that's something I want to say yes to.
Awesome, Tim. Well, it's been great talking to you. Thanks again, and looking forward to staying in touch.
I appreciate it, Justin. Thank you.